Before we even dive into the tactical pieces of how to ask a good question, we want to make sure that everyone here has the right mentality around asking questions. And this is something that Rahul and I will try to do when it comes to providing advice. Like we don't only focus on the nuts and bolts. In order for someone to truly succeed, like not only do they have to know to how to tactically execute something, they need to have the right mentality and like mindset going in to learning some or mastering some piece of the tech career growth ecosystem in order to succeed within that space. So this is kind of the meta slide for this concept. But the number one thing when it comes to asking questions is that you should not be afraid to ask questions. And what I've seen a lot is that people are really afraid of how they are perceived when they're asking questions, especially like more junior folks, folks who are newer to tech, which is most of this community, which makes sense. And the problem with that is, well, if you're paralyzed from asking questions, you're not going to ask questions, and then you're not going to learn as fast, and you're going to stay junior for a longer period of time. And I think this kind of quote from Carl Sagan really captures it, in that there's really no such thing as like a dumb or stupid question. And I've said this many times before, because like in the end, every question is an attempt from someone to learn, like to become more familiar with the world. And if you think that person is dumb or stupid for doing so, that's just kind of cruel, right? So Rahul, if you just keep going through the bullet points here. So avoid perception paralysis. And when it comes to asking questions, you should ask as many as you can. Of course, we want to make sure that the questions are good before you ask them, which we'll cover in the next slide. But as long as you're asking good questions, you should ask as many as you can. I firmly believe that if you're asking questions the right way, people will not get mad at you for asking like a ton of questions, like literally like 3, 4, 5 questions per day. If you're asking them in a very thoughtful way, I don't think your team or whatever group, like a community that you're within, won't get mad at you for doing that. And I've told this many times before to people I mentor, because even though I'm not like formally a manager, I spent a lot of time mentoring other engineers at my day job. So I mentor engineers at Robinhood, and I mentored a lot of engineers at Facebook. And for any like new engineer, like either they're like more junior engineer or they're just new to the team, but have experience, I always tell them, if there's one metric you want to measure, like how well you're onboarding, it's the number of questions you ask, like within the first 1 or 2 months of you being on this team. So you just want to like crank that up as much as possible. And I basically tell them like, and if you're afraid to like ask questions to the broader group, you can at least ask questions to me, right? I don't care if you ask me like 10 questions per day. I just want you to learn and onboard as quickly as possible. And if you're joining any sort of like reasonable, like not evil company, like no one wants to dunk on the new person. Like no one's going to be like, wow, your questions are stupid. Like, how did you not know this? You're an idiot. Like no one's going to do that. So please keep that in mind. It's like, especially if you're, joining a new team or just onboarding into a new space. Asking a question, and like maybe like, let's say you ask a question and it's maybe a bit of a silly question. It's better than just being stuck for hours and hours, right? And I've seen, people do this, which is unfortunate. Like instead of asking a question, they would rather try to figure it out themselves and like tough it out. And they'll spend like 2 whole days solving something that could have been solved by asking a question, which would have taken like 30 minutes, right? So you just waste a huge amount of time just being stuck and just kind of being afraid of asking a question. So like my rule of thumb is, if you're completely stuck for 15 minutes plus, like you spend 15 minutes and you're not making any progress, like you're Googling things and doing all this other stuff, and you can't like, change the crash or get into a different crash, or like, get it to break a different place, then I would just, start the question asking process. And it's better for everyone, because like number one, you become a more productive member of the team faster. And then number two, which is covered in the next point, you are creating a resource for others when you ask a question. So it's actually interesting, because a lot of things eventually circle back to content creation. So when you're asking a question, assuming you're doing it in a public space, which you should, you're creating a resource. So at Facebook in particular, people lean everyone towards asking questions in a public place as possible, either a big group chat or this thing called Workplace. So Facebook actually uses an enterprise version of itself to conduct its work. called Workplace. So a lot of questions happen on Workplace, and the awesome thing about that is that they're captured on the public record. So like if you ask a good question, you get a good answer. It's now documented for like the 55,000 employees of Facebook. And we kind of have a mini version of that in our Slack community. Like if you ask like a great question on Slack, and you get a great answer, then now 5,800 people at this point can like also really get value from that question and answer. So like if you do this right, and we'll cover this more in future slides, like if you do the question asking right, you're actually like building social capital, like building stature and respect within the team, because you're creating helpful content for other folks. And there have been so many scenarios I've seen where like a junior engineer got stuck on this thing, and this other junior engineer is also stuck on that thing. So like when junior engineer 1 asked the question to unblock themselves, junior engineer 2 was like so relieved because like, oh, I'm also stuck on this thing, but I was like a bit afraid to ask a question. So I'm so glad that you asked this question. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions. That's the main point here.
One thing I want to add here is that when I teach the Android class at Stanford, I exactly say bullet point number 4. What I tell people is that if you're stuck for more than 20 minutes, then you should really not spend any more time on that particular problem. And instead, what you should do is document what you're doing, what you're trying to do, what you are currently experiencing, and what you've tried. And then just make a post. So we have a forum called Ed Discussion, which we use for the class. I think this is especially important if you're new to a platform or a framework like Android. There have been, when I was learning Android back in the day, there were definitely times when I would spend literally 3 or 4 hours down a rabbit hole, which ended up being, oh, I forgot the internet permission in my Android manifest file. And like that completely screwed me over and I wasted a bunch of time, right? And so, especially if you don't really have an understanding of how the pieces fit together, then I think you really want to fail fast. I mean, fail is not the right word, but like you want to like opt to go to the question asking phase quickly. So 15, 20 minutes is a really good benchmark for that.